Energy is a huge part of what's going on now for a couple reasons. Number one, anybody who's seen Dune, right, knows that the spice must flow, right? And in many ways, oil is the spice that keeps the global economy running. So to think that we could talk about all these big macro events that are going on and that somehow energy wasn't a part of it would be silly.
Right.
So I think whether it's a byproduct of everything else that's going on or if that's the cause, I don't really know, but I know it's a huge factor. And to your point, I'll use the word disastrous, people can use whatever word that they want. These kind of disastrous energy policies and green mandates that have been put in place before we were ready to have any kind of a transition is kind of pervading it. And of course, the way I always come at it from the big picture down, and my focus is on currencies. It's important to understand that there's a couple dynamics that affect currencies that are directly tied to energy, right? And then this plays into geopolitics and military issues that are going on with Russia and China and Ukraine and Europe. So it's all interconnected. It's hard to talk about just oil without seeping into these other areas.
Yeah, you can't.
But obviously the big issue with oil and with many other commodities is that they're priced and typically traded in dollars. And whether you're doing business in the United States, that's typically the case. That's changing a bit on the edges, but by and large, the world still trades on dollars, and energy trade around the world takes place in dollars. Part of the issue that's happening now is that over the last, let's just call it 10 years, the US has become more self-sufficient in energy terms. Now, again, I think there was a couple years where we were actually a net exporter. I think in the last year, we're maybe back to being a marginal net importer. It depends on whether shale's currently pumping or not. But this is important for a couple of reasons, because as the US becomes more energy self-sufficient and it does not need to buy oil from the Middle East or Venezuela or Russia or wherever it is, that not only helps their domestic industry, but it also ends up meaning that less dollars are getting distributed outside the United States. For years and years, we were a huge net oil importer, so the oil would come in and the dollars would go out. And then those dollars would exist in the euro-dollar market, and it would provide liquidity for the euro-dollar market. But as the US has become more energy self-sufficient, they don't have to export dollars for as many imports of energy as they used to. But a big part of it is that a lot of the US dollar debt that exists in the euro dollar market was extended or put in place, however you want to think about that, while the US was exporting a lot of dollars. So you have a situation where a lot of credit was extended and a lot of debt was taken on when there was a lot of liquidity. But now moving forward, due to the fact that we're exporting fewer dollars and that the US is tightening monetary policy, it just means that there's less dollars circulating, not just in the United States, but especially in the euro dollar market. And so then it just becomes this vicious cycle. And we've talked about this several times, right? But now you have a situation where, due to these energy policies, due to the military conflicts and political conflicts that are going on, and due to the tightening of the money supply in the United States, you've already got oil rising in all terms, but even more in other country terms, right? So if you think about the euro and the yen, or even the yuan, their currencies are down and UK, their currencies are down anywhere from 5 to 20% this year.
Right.
If oil is at $90 or whatever, $88 or whatever it is today, and oil prices are going higher, and then your currency is losing value versus the dollar, that's another 10 or 20% kicker on top of it. And then you get into the supply chain issues where energy could gap up even higher. You've got this perfect storm for chaos, really.
Yeah.
Lack of a better word. But in short, I think oil and energy is a huge part of this. And energy is in many ways driving the geopolitical conflicts right now between Russia and Ukraine, and Europe and Russia. The thesis has always been that whether the Fed wants it or not, ultimately the dollar will get away from them to the upside. And the reason I say get away from them is I think currently they want a stronger dollar, and we should probably talk about that. But even I think that before this is all said and done, the dollar will go higher than they want it to go And it doesn't mean it's going to go in a straight line, and there will no doubt be periods of dollar weakness along the way. Well, even though the Fed might want a stronger dollar in the short term, they don't want a dollar that's rising so fast that it's out of control, because that will literally wreck the entire monetary system. The monetary system wasn't set up for a continually increasing dollar. It will literally cause the system to crash. So while they may want the dollar higher in the short term, I don't think they want it significantly higher in the long term. But ultimately, I think that will happen. Now, in the short term, I think that they actually do want a stronger dollar, because a stronger dollar right now accomplishes several things. And I think some of these things they would admit to, and some of them I think they would not admit to, and some others they may vehemently deny, even though really they do want it. Right now, for better for worse, even though they want inflation, a small amount of inflation over time that allows them to inflate away the debt, they don't want double-digit inflation year over year. And the reason they don't want that high of inflation year over year is because that is very politically hard to handle. It causes too much stress in the local economy. It causes citizens to push back on business leaders, government leaders, officials, et cetera, et cetera. So the government would love to get 3 or 4. They say their target is 2. I think they would love 3 or 4% inflation for 5 or 10 years, and they inflate 25 to 50% of the debt away. I think they would absolutely love that. The problem is it's very hard to get 3 or 4% consistent inflation. What you get is this very lumpy, crazy inflation that we've had over the last, call it, year or 2 years. And so because of the political pushback that they're getting, and because of what's going on in the global economy with all this inflation, they are trying to dial it back down. Not the least of which is their reputation. They don't want to blow up their reputation, and they're very embarrassed. The Fed, I'm talking about, the Fed's very embarrassed that inflation came in so high, and they were wrong on the transitory nature of it. And so they want to get it back down for a few reasons. They want to get it back down in order to restore their reputation, but they also want to get it back down so that the pushback economically and politically is less. And the way that they're trying to do that is by killing demand, right? They don't really have control over the supply side of the equation, but they think they have control over the demand side of the equation. And if you tighten monetary supply, which means you're taking liquidity out of the system, either through open market operations of the Fed or through raising interest rates, tighter monetary supply should lead to less growth. For better or for worse, I think Powell has been about as clear a speaking central banker as I've ever heard. All year he has come out and said, we need to get inflation under control. It's our primary concern. We're going to raise rates. And whenever the market has misinterpreted him, he's come out a few days later or a few weeks later and said, hey, I want to be clear. You guys aren't listening to me. I'm going to raise rates, and we are going to have some pain. And that means that people are going to have to get paid less. They're going to have to lose their jobs, and house prices are going to have to come down. And even though those are bad things, that will be less bad than letting inflation run hot. He's been very clear about it. Now, you might think he's lying. You might think that he's wrong. You might think he's misguided. That's fine, but there's really no confusion in what his words are saying. And so I think that raising rates and getting the dollar stronger is what they are trying to do in order to get inflation down. Now, ironically, or unironically, depending on where you're sitting, is that by trying to tamp down inflation domestically by raising the dollar, they're actually exacerbating inflation overseas. And what I mean by that is if the dollar is going up 10 or 15%, that means other currencies are going down 10 or 15%. And so if we already have high levels of inflation in the US, and now those same goods are even more expensive in euro terms or yen terms or Australian dollar terms or whatever it is, and it's causing those other countries to support their currencies because their currencies are losing value too much, and those other countries, in addition to trying to support their currencies, they're also trying to support their bond markets through some form of QE. You get into a situation where you're exacerbating the same issues that the Fed is fighting domestically are being exacerbated outside the United States. And I think we've talked about this before, but this whole situation, there's a name for it. It's called Triffins Dilemma. And Triffin was an economist back in the 60s, and he coined this term, and he said, If an individual country's currency is used as a domestic currency and simultaneously used as the global currency, at some point along the way, it will come into the needs of the domestic economy will come into conflict with the needs of the global economy. And that's literally right exactly where we're at. The rest of the world, because it trades in dollars and because the dollar is higher, their local currencies are worth less. It's making their funding costs higher. It's causing their economies to slow. And it's just a real mess. And so we're right in the heart of this Triffins Dilemma, where the US needs one thing and the global economy needs the other. And the Fed and the other central banks around the world are trying to thread this very small needle hole. I personally believe that there's another thing that's going on here that, while not the direct reason that they're raising rates, is a byproduct that they don't mind. And that is that I think that part of the reason that they raise rates is it, at least in the short term, now we can probably have a big argument of how this ends up in the long run, but in the short term, it cements the United States position as on the top of the mountain. And what I mean by that is, if the whole world is slowing down economically and having these problems, but the US is in a relatively better place, and by raising rates in the US, because that's what the US needs, but by also hurting other countries in the process, even if everybody's going down, those other countries are coming under more pressure than the United States is. So on a relative basis, the US is securing its spot on top of the mountain. The other part that it does is, I think that it will force countries to choose sides. And what I mean by that is, I think we can probably all agree that whereas for the last 20 or 30 years, the whole world was moving towards one globalized economy and peaceful one world, over the last couple of years, that started to fracture. And now we're going away from globalization more towards deglobalization. And we're going to have, rather than have one supply chain, we're going to have two or multiple supply chains. Countries are going to have to try to become more self-sufficient rather than relying on others. And in that whole dynamic, there's East versus West, China versus the United States, Russia versus the United States, Russia versus Europe. So there's all these geopolitical, issues as well. And I think by putting countries that are maybe on the margin, they're not quite sure whether they would be better off to go with the East or the West, or with the US or not with the US. The US can put them in a vulnerable spot. It could then force them, or try to force them, or at least manipulate that country into joining the US. And maybe the US says something like, we will help you out with your funding needs, or we'll give you a swap line, or we'll help you on some trade deals, give you a break on some prices. But in exchange, we're going to need you to vote with us at the UN on this thing, or we're going to need you to sign this trade agreement, whatever it is. But I think going forward, where in the past we've handed out swap lines or been more willing to use dollar policy to help the global economy, I think now we're going to be more focused on using the dollar to help the US specifically, and then helping our friends where we think it's most advantageous to do.